Erased. That is the only word for what happened. Not lost by accident, not forgotten through time, erased, with purpose, with calculation, and with the full knowledge of what was being destroyed, because what stood here was not supposed to be possible. Not according to the story the world was told about Africa, not according to the version of history that was written after the conquerors arrived. So here's the question that no one in power has ever wanted you to ask. What were these kingdoms really? And why was so much effort spent making sure you would never find out? Long before the word civilization was borrowed from Latin, long before maps were drawn by hands that had never touched African soil, there was a world here, ordered, magnificent, and ancient beyond the telling of it. Cities that planned their streets by the movement of stars, courts where law was spoken aloud, memorized, recited, and debated for generations, armies that held empires together not merely by force but by a code of honor so precise that it was sung, not written. These were not scattered villages. According to historians and archaeologists who have spent their lives in the soil of this continent, the kingdoms of ancient Africa were among the most sophisticated governing structures the ancient world ever produced. Mali, Songhai, Kush, Great Zimbabwe, Benin, Oyo, Kanem-Bornu, each one a world unto itself, each one deliberately removed from the story the world was taught. And that is where the truth begins to fade. Let us begin with the one that should have changed everything. The Mali Empire, at its peak stretching across an area larger than Western Europe, controlling more than half of the world's gold, and governed by a man whose name allegedly made the courts of Europe and the Middle East fall silent with awe. Mansa Musa, feared, yet celebrated, commanding, yet described by those who met him as a man of extraordinary calm. According to oral tradition and contemporary Arab scholarship, when Mansa Musa made his pilgrimage to Mecca in 1324, he traveled with an entourage of 60,000 people. 60,000. He gave away so much gold along the route, allegedly, that the economies of Egypt and the Arab world were destabilized for over a decade. The price of gold crashed, not because of war, not because of plague, because one African king passed through. And yet, when you open a history textbook in most schools in the world today, you will find his name in a footnote, if at all. Why? Here is where the story becomes uncomfortable, because the Mali Empire was not alone. The Kingdom of Kush, in what is now Sudan, existed for over 1,000 years. It conquered Egypt. It sat pharaohs on the throne of one of the ancient world's most powerful civilizations. The Kushite rulers did not bow to Egypt. They ruled it. For nearly a century, the Black Pharaohs of the 25th dynasty governed the Nile Valley, building pyramids, conducting rituals, commanding armies. According to historians, they restored temples that had fallen into ruin. They revived religious practices that had been abandoned. They governed with such precision that later Egyptian rulers modeled their courts on what the Kushites had built. Then there was Great Zimbabwe, a city of stone, built without mortar, without foreign expertise, without any of the tools that colonial-era archaeologists insisted were necessary for such construction. When European explorers first saw it in the 19th century, they refused to believe Africans had built it. They proposed Phoenicians. They proposed Arabs. They proposed the Queen of Sheba. Anyone, rather than the obvious truth standing directly in front of them. And that refusal to see what was plainly there is one of the most documented acts of deliberate erasure in modern historical scholarship. They did not just ignore Africa. They looked directly at its greatness and chose to lie. Now, here is the question that splits historians, that divides academics, that makes people in comment sections argue for hours. Was the erasure of African history an accident of time, or was it a policy? Some scholars argue that much was simply lost, that time destroys all things, that Africa's reliance on oral tradition rather than written record made preservation harder. That is a fair argument. But how do you explain the Benin bronzes? Over 3,000 sacred objects, taken by British soldiers in 1897 during the punitive expedition. Not discovered, not rescued, seized, carried to London, sold, scattered across the museums of Europe. These were not primitive objects. They were among the most technically sophisticated bronze castings produced anywhere in the world before the 17th century. The craftsmen of Benin were not behind Europe. According to art historians who have studied these works, in many techniques they were ahead. So I ask again, was this an accident of history? Or was this protection of a story? Drop your answer below, because this is the debate that matters. But here is the part that changes the shape of everything. The story we know today is not the story they lived. Because here is what most accounts of African kingdoms leave out. The kingdoms did not fall only to outside force. Some fell to drought. Some fell to trade route shifts. Some fell to the weight of their own complexity. The same way every great civilization eventually reaches the edge of what it built. They were human. They had brilliant kings and corrupt ones, wise councils and broken alliances, spiritual systems that held communities together, and power struggles that tore them apart. According to oral traditions preserved by griots across West Africa, the fall of Songhai was not simply the arrival of Moroccan soldiers. It was also the fracturing of the empire from within. Rivalries, of betrayal at the highest levels of court. And then, something changed. The Moroccan army crossed the Sahara, armed with firearms the Songhai had never encountered, and a civilization that had stood for over 4 centuries in a single battle. But here's what the conquerors did not expect. The knowledge survived. Scholars buried manuscripts under floors. Priests sealed sacred objects inside walls. Griots, the living memory of the people, scattered, carried the names, the histories, the ceremonies, deep into villages where soldiers never reached. They tried to erase it. They tried to silence it. They tried to bury it beneath the weight of a new story. But some things cannot be buried. So ask yourself something, not as a viewer, as a person who carries the inheritance of this history. If these kingdoms were as powerful as the evidence suggests, if their art, their governance, their philosophy, their science were as sophisticated as the records show, why is the default assumption, even now, that Africa needed to be taught civilization? Because here is what the evidence actually shows. When the Mali Empire was at its height, London was a city of wooden buildings and unpaved streets. When the scholars of Timbuktu were copying and debating manuscripts on astronomy, law, and medicine, most of Europe had not yet produced a university. According to researchers who have catalogued the surviving manuscripts of Timbuktu, allegedly numbering in the hundreds of thousands, these texts covered subjects from advanced mathematics to surgical technique to the ethics of governance. Hundreds of thousands. Most still unread. Most still untranslated. Most still buried in private collections across the Sahel. If this was hidden, what else has been? What is still waiting? Beneath the sand, beneath the silence, beneath the story we were all told. I want you to answer something. And I mean, genuinely answer it. Which African kingdom do you believe deserved more from history? And was this erasure an accident or a decision? Leave it below, because the comments on this video are going to start a conversation that should have happened a long time ago. Here is what I want you to carry away from this. These kingdoms were not legends. They were real, built by real hands, governed by real minds, sustained by real belief in something larger than any one king, any one dynasty, any one generation. The Mali Empire traded across 3 continents. The Kingdom of Kush shaped the civilization that the Western world calls its foundation. The city of Timbuktu held a library that rivaled anything the ancient world had built. The walls of Great Zimbabwe were raised without a single piece of foreign knowledge, only African hands, African intelligence, African vision. Not primitive, not pre-civilized, not waiting for the world to arrive, already there. Some say these kingdoms fell, and yes, they changed. They transformed. They were interrupted. But the knowledge that built them did not fall. It passed into the earth, into the songs of griots, into the hands of women who hid manuscripts under the floors of their homes, into the memories of children who were told, remember this, even if you cannot say it aloud. Not lost, buried, not erased, waiting. And the longer the world refuses to look honestly at what Africa built, the longer the world remains ignorant of itself. Because Africa's history is not a regional story, it is the beginning of the human story. If this video gave you something you did not have before, a name, a fact, a question that will not leave you, then you already understand why this channel exists. Ancient African history does not chase trends. We uncover what was buried. We restore what was silenced. We give voice to the stories that were never supposed to survive. Subscribe, ring the bell, because the next story we are telling is one that reaches back to a time before the oldest kingdom on this list was built. And it will change the way you understand everything that came after. Not lost, not forgotten, just hidden. Until now.